Thanks for buying a Santevia dispenser system. Today what we're going to show you is how to use the float valve. The float valve is one of the most important parts of your gravity water system dispenser model because what it does is it actually stops the water from going from the gravity water system into your dispenser. The way that it does that is when water flows from your gravity water system into the dispenser, once it reaches a certain point, it will raise the float. You'll see that the float actually goes up and down. Today we're going to talk about the gravity water system dispenser model and some troubleshooting tips for the float valve. The float valve is the part that stops water from flowing from your gravity water system down into your dispenser. The float valve has two positions. One where it's completely open, and when the water rises, it actually raises the float into the stopped or closed position. The float valve can go down and up. Down is open, up is closed. There are two very important parts on the float valve. The first is the valve, which is this part right in here, and the second is the float. The float is full of air, and when the water level rises past the float, it will raise the float into the closed position by pressing the silicone stopper into the valve. The float valve sits right here inside of the gravity water system dispenser model. The float valve is at the base of the gravity water system dispenser model. As water rises in the dispenser, it will reach the float valve, and at a certain point, it will raise the float of the float valve, forcing the float valve shut. There are a few different components of the float valve that I want to share with you. The first is the float. This is basically just an empty cup full of air. As water rises, it will raise and lower, opening and closing the valve. I'm going to take apart this float valve and show you how it stops the water. By unscrewing the float valve at this point here, we're going to see the silicone stopper. When the float raises, it's going to press this silicone stopper against this opening in the float valve. When this silicone stopper presses against this opening in the float valve, it will stop the flow of water from the gravity water system into your dispenser. You need to make sure that your float valve has this silicone stopper in it. If this silicone stopper is old, calcified, or dirty, you can actually remove it and give it a wash, and then reinsert it into the float valve. To reassemble this float valve, you'll raise the collar and thread the top back onto the float. Over time, you may see that your float valve becomes calcified. This can happen in regions with really hard water. What we recommend if your float valve becomes calcified is to clean it with a water and vinegar solution. All you will do is create a solution of 1 part vinegar to 4 parts water and submerge your float valve in it for about an hour. Once you remove your float valve from the water and vinegar solution, you'll just simply rinse it off and you can reinstall it into your dispenser system. When setting up your gravity water system dispenser model, it's really important to make sure that the float valve is installed correctly. If you were to use this dispenser model without the float valve, you would actually just have water constantly pouring into your dispenser model, and sooner or later, the water would overflow the tank that is inside of your dispenser. This float valve serves to stop the water when your tank in your dispenser system is full. If you notice that your gravity water system dispenser model is leaking, there are a few things that you should check. The first is that your float valve is correctly installed. To install your float valve, what you're going to want to do is unscrew this nut on top of the float valve. There are 2 washers on this float valve. The first washer should stay on the base of the neck of the float valve, and then you will thread this into the dispenser lower tank. The second washer will go on the inside of the dispenser lower tank. And then you will install the nut. The float valve should only be installed hand tight. However, if you notice that there's a slow drip or leak, what you can do is turn this nut another quarter turn, just to ensure that it's tight on the base of your lower tank. The second thing that we could try, if your system is still leaking, is to ensure that the float valve is low enough so that you're not having water overflow in your dispenser. To do this, what we want to do is lower the float. The way that we lower the float is simply by grabbing the neck at the top of the float and simply turning it. In this case, left or clockwise will loosen the float. You can lower this float about 3/4 of an inch. However, to start, we recommend lowering it just by a couple turns. You see I've just lowered the float by turning it clockwise, but if I wanted to allow more water to go into the dispenser, what I would do is actually raise the float by turning it counterclockwise. To lower the float, I'm going to turn it clockwise. This will allow less water in the dispenser underneath the gravity water system. However, if I want more water in the dispenser underneath the gravity water system, I will raise the float by turning it counterclockwise. If you have other questions, feel free to reach out to us at help@santevia.com or give us a phone call at 1-866-943-9220.